Wouldn't it be sad if everything you were told for the last 40 years by people that you trusted turned out to be nothing but a big fat lie? Well, that just may be the case. One of the blessings I get through reading your comments are the ideas that you share with me, the recipes, the books you've read, and the documentaries you've watched. And just sometimes those recipes, books, and documentaries make their way into an episode of Beat Diabetes, which is exactly the case today. A while back, someone recommended the documentary called Fat Fiction, which was written by Jennifer Isenhart and narrated by Dr. Mark Hyman. I made a note of it and recently viewed it, and today's video is the result. I knew I was going to like this video when I saw some of the people sharing insights early on because they were like old friends to me. People like Dr. Jason Fung, Dr. Eric Westman, Dr. Sarah Hallberg, Dr. Mark Hyman, Gary Taubes, and Tim Noakes. Now, these are all people I have respected and I have read. This documentary is about fat, dietary fat, that is, and the role it plays in improving health and bringing about the reversal of diabetes. Now, it begins with an assessment of just how wrong the medical, nutritional, and government experts were back in the 1970s and 80s when they began recommending a low-fat, high-carb diet as the means of good health. They also said it would help with heart disease and weight loss. Now, I won't go into all the details as to the specifics of just why and how this colossal mistake was made, but the short version of it is this. All these so-called experts began telling Americans that fat is the villain behind obesity, heart disease, diabetes, and almost everything else, and this was exported practically to the whole world. Nearly all our health problems will be solved, in their opinion, if we'll just slash that fat from our diets. We will lose weight, we'll never get a heart attack, and diabetes will be a thing of the past. There were bogus studies and impressive researchers who preached this with total sincerity, and the world swallowed the idea hook, line, and sinker. But there was a problem, and it was not a small one. The problem was this was by no means proven. There were no definite studies, there was no irrefutable research that made this a certainty. It was a nice theory. It seemed to make some sense, but it was nothing more than that. And in this documentary, this Fat Fiction documentary, various doctors and nutritionists give their reaction. Dr. Mark Hyman, who narrates the documentary, says this: "We got the whole story wrong. We were told to eat 6 to 11 servings of bread, rice, cereal, and pasta a day by the government in the food pyramid. It should be called the food tombstone." Dr. Sarah Hallberg relates, "The low-fat diet was essentially a huge experiment on millions of people, and it failed miserably." Nina Teicholz says it was just an idea, but it was launched as a policy for all Americans based really on no evidence at all. And Gary Taubes states, "We screwed up. It happens all the time in science. Medical orthodoxy latched onto the wrong explanation, made a tragic mistake, and now we're living with the consequences." A major reality that should shake our faith in this idea that a low-fat diet brings about better health for all is the fact that Americans began to do just as they were told. They did indeed cut the fat in their diets. They ate less fatty meats and moved toward lean meats. They cut butter and cream out of their diets and used margarine and drank skim milk. They ate nasty egg whites rather than the whole egg. We were told to cut that fat, and we did as we were told. Not everybody, of course, but as a nation, our fat consumption dropped way down. And the result was catastrophic. Obesity exploded. Diabetes went through the roof. Heart disease multiplied. We not only did not enter the promised land of good health, after several decades of lowering our fat intake, we were farther from it than we ever were before. much farther. One of the most telling points in this documentary is when they show you some scenes, one from 1969 and one from the current day, scenes of large crowds. The contrast is shocking. Back in the late 60s, almost everybody in the crowd was slim. There were almost no obese people. The scene from today shows the majority of the people in the crowd are obese, not just slightly plump, but significantly overweight. One television personality shared this about the people who watched the launching of Apollo 11 in 1969. He said, "Watching the footage of the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, I was struck by how not fat everyone in the crowd was. We looked like a completely different race of people." In speaking of how fat was labeled as the boogeyman for almost all of our health problems, Dr. Jason Fung says this, "To blame an ancient food for a modern disease was completely illogical. It didn't make any sense, but you repeat things enough, and you can get it out there enough, and people will believe you." But starting with Dr. Robert Atkins and then followed by a dedicated group of other doctors, researchers, and nutritionists, another hypothesis was put forth. This was the idea that the problems that the low-fat, high-carb diet was supposed to solve were actually resolved by the very opposite diet. Good health was gained by turning the notorious food pyramid upside down and eating a low-carb, high-fat diet. That was an interesting theory, but what took this out of the realm of hypothesis and into the realm of science was the fact that people actually responded well to this diet. Men and women lost weight, and amazingly, they often were able to reverse their diabetes and found their A1Cs going down rather than up. And regardless of how many people may be saying otherwise, when something works, and it works dramatically and amazingly well, the word will begin to get out. More and more doctors and nutritionists began to say, "Now, wait a minute. Maybe we got this whole low-fat dietary thing dead wrong." Dr. Eric Westman is one of the doctors who believes this, and he states, "I can treat not only obesity, but I can treat type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure. In fact, I have to take away medications from people as they get better." Professor Tim Noakes, who's been advocating for the low-carb, high-fat diet for a long time, refers to the low-carb approach this way. He says this is as big as the discovery of insulin or antibiotics. The problem with the low-fat diet was not just the fact that fat in the diet was reduced. The problem was sugar became fat's replacement. Once fat got a bad reputation, many of the food producers advertised their products as being low-fat. But of course, when you take away the fat, you take away the taste. So you have to add something back in to get people to like it. And the cheapest, the most effective, and the most simple replacement for the missing fat was sugar or high-fructose corn syrup. Endocrinologist Robert Lustig declares, "When we took the fat out of the food, what did we do? We put something in which was way worse, sugar." In this documentary, they show some of the ads for the new, improved low-fat foods as our whole country was turning to a low-fat, high-carb diet. One of the commercials boasted of their reduced-fat Oreos. Another ad proudly announced that Hershey's chocolate syrup is virtually fat-free. A yogurt company bragged, "Continental yogurt is non-fat, not low-fat, non-fat." Pringles potato chips promoted fat-free potato chips, and then they showed a woman asking, "How did they do that?" Before the 1960s, carbs were considered fattening, something to be avoided if you were struggling with weight. But now, carbs were pushed to the max, regardless of how much sugar they contained. As long as they didn't contain that terrible fat, they were healthy, noble, and virtuous. The sugar industry was just thrilled at this development. With all the focus on fat as the dietary villain, nobody was worrying about sugar anymore. Dr. Mark Hyman stated, "Not surprisingly, the sugar industry also preferred to point the finger to saturated fat. Recently discovered documents reveal that in 1965, the sugar industry paid prominent Harvard researchers to do just that. These so-called objective researchers were actually paid good big money to point the blame away from sugar and put it on saturated fat. The documents that have been uncovered include names and dates in the actual letter telling the researchers to make sure that fat and not sugar gets all the blame. Even the American Heart Association jumped on the low-fat bandwagon, and they would authorize great big check marks to be displayed on food products that were low in fat as being heart healthy. And so you had foods like Cocoa Krispies and Lucky Charms cereals proudly demonstrating with a great big check mark on the boxes that they were heart healthy. Never mind the fact that they were loaded with sugar and made with white flour, at least they had no fat. And that should be good enough, thank you very much. Sadly, the American Diabetes Association also piled on. They began recommending that diabetics eat plenty of carbs. Just make sure they're whole grain carbs and keep that fat very low, and you'll be fine. The problem was this just did not work. Diabetics got worse and worse and required more and more meds and eventually more and more insulin. One of the most powerful segments in this documentary is where they compare the success rate in helping diabetics between Dr. Sarah Hallberg and her low-carb approach and the American Diabetes Association with its low-fat, high-carb plan. Mark Hyman says this, in her clinical trial of nearly 500 patients, 60% of the intervention group reversed their diagnosis of diabetes. That's more than half the patients whose blood sugars normalized. 94% had their insulin doses decreased or totally eliminated, with no increase in their LDL cholesterol. By comparison, the American Diabetes Association reports a less than 1% success rate at reversing diabetes when following their own low-fat advice. Think about that. By the ADA's own admission, they help less than 1% of diabetics turn back the clock and go from diabetic numbers to non-diabetic numbers. Less than 1%. But with a low-carb approach, around 60% can do this, at least in this study. And I'd question whether those other 40% were really following a strict low-carb diet, because in my experience, it's well over 60% of diabetics who can drop their numbers below the diabetic range when they follow a low-carb, high-fat diet long enough. And by restricting their window of eating and doing some intermittent fasting, they would likely have more success still. Now, if you have blown out your pancreas and the beta cells are dead or dormant, you may need to take insulin, but even then, by going low-carb, high-fat and taking smaller amounts of insulin, most type 2s should be able to get their A1Cs below 6.5, the number which doctors consider to be the demarcation line between a diabetic and a non-diabetic state. Many times when a man or woman is diagnosed with diabetes, their attitude is, well, I'm just going to follow the doctors. They're trained and they specialize in health. I'm just a mechanic or just a secretary or a school teacher or whatever. I'll do what they tell me. Well, that makes sense and it has a certain degree of logic in it. And that was the attitude of my own mother when she was diagnosed as diabetic. She followed her doctor's advice. She cut the fat in her diet way down and tried to eat lots of healthy carbs. The problem was she got worse and worse and needed constant procedures and surgeries and eventually had both her legs amputated. She had strokes and ultimately died of a heart attack. And when she went into the hospital that last time, her blood sugar was around 500 milligrams per deciliter. Here's the problem when you say, I'm just going to follow the doctors. Which doctors are you going to follow? Because the doctors themselves don't agree with each other. And those who follow that tired, stale, worn-out plan of simply switching from white bread to whole wheat and eating lean meat are rarely successful. Let me underscore the word rarely successful in reversing diabetes. But in this documentary called Fat Fiction, you'll hear from a number of doctors who believe in a new paradigm for fighting obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, and, of course, diabetes. They are convinced, as I am, that not only for diabetes, but for optimum health in general, It's a low-carb diet that embraces fat rather than runs from it, which is the best, the most effective, the quickest, and the surest route to go from diabetes to non-diabetes, from obese to a normal weight, and will help you in so many other ways. Ultimately, it is your decision, of course. Your dietary preferences or choices nobody but you can make, and no one but you will have to live with the consequences. But do not be deceived. The idea that the only possible approach to beating diabetes and having good health is to eat lots of whole grain carbs and avoid fat is not the only idea that's out there, and it's definitely not the idea that's working. And there are a good number of doctors, nutritionists, and researchers today who will tell you the exact opposite, that you should do a low-carb, high-fat diet, complete with some intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating if you can, and you will see great results. And the number of these doctors and researchers that believe this are growing every year. And they will say to you, don't cut the fat, cut the carbs, and then watch. What should you watch? Watch your glucose levels drop. Watch your pounds come off almost effortlessly. And as a bonus, there's a pretty good chance you may not need that blood pressure pill after a while. So here is some food for thought. Low-carb food, that is. Hope you enjoyed this and found it helpful. If so, give it a thumbs up so YouTube will promote it to other diabetics that really need to see these things. And consider subscribing to this channel and then hit that bell icon so you'll be notified every time we post a new video. God bless. See you again soon.